two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. That's from Robert Frost. As Ms. Kelly said, my name is Otis G. Sanders. I'm a professional photographer. I've been shooting since I was 12 years old. I'm also a published author. I have 3 books published to this point. I'm working on the 4th and 5th as we speak, kind of, sort of. I am also, in the last year, a YouTube content creator, where I've actually started doing videotape. I have about 4 playlists on my YouTube channel. So today, this morning, we are going to talk about time travel photography. I picked this title because it's appropriate and relevant to what I'll be speaking about today. And what I'll be speaking about today is time travel with photographs, the journey, and the destination. So the next few minutes, you guys, I'll be talking about a bit of my history in photography, all the way back from the beginning. Not every detail, of course, because that would actually take a little bit too long. So we'll start off with time travel with photographs. Now, this, to a lot of you guys, may look like just a shack. And when I look at it these days myself, it's a shack to me also, but this is where I was born. I was born in rural Alabama in 1961. April 23rd, as a matter of fact, I just turned 57 last month. I am the 7th son, the 10th child. There were 7 boys and 3 girls in my family. I'm the 7th son and the last. This is where we were all born, all 10 of us. Now, since I'm the 10th child in the family of 10, the first 5 kids were gone by the time I was born. My oldest sister was having her daughter a year after I was born, so my niece is actually 1 year younger than I am. This is my father, one of those good old-fashioned Southern gentlemen, really peculiar, interesting in his way of doing things and relating to folk. This is my mother. She was the one that had those 7 boys. And of course, back in the South in those days, it was a great thing to have 7 sons, because that meant the father could take the kids out of school and help him work to make money for the family. Now, of course, that house we lived in had no running water, no electricity, no plumbing, anything like that. We had a spring down the hill where we got our water. We had an outhouse. And for light, we used kerosene lamps. Sometimes candles, but kerosene lamps were the most common thing used in those days. And my brothers would always tell me that during their time in school, they would be taken out to help my father work in turpentine. Turpentine was a process where they'd go out and tap these trees, put containers underneath and let the sap fall into it. They'd come back, collect them, and they would process it into turpentine. Now, since this is a bit of my history, this is where I'm going to start you guys off. I was about early 20s here in art school. I went to the Atlanta College of Art in Atlanta, Georgia. I grew up here, born in Alabama, moved out here when I was 12, decided I wanted to get out of California because that circle was getting close. And that circle happens sometimes when you're living in certain areas within our communities where things start happening and they get closer and closer to you. So the only thing to do is either get caught up in it and be a part of it, or leave. I decided to leave. I had a choice of schools in San Francisco, Michigan, and Georgia. I decided to go to Georgia because Detroit was too cold. San Francisco was too close to home. And Atlanta was close enough to Alabama where I grew up, so I decided to go there. Now, this is one of the images that I chose to add to this presentation because it has kind of a double meaning for me. Now, most of the images that you guys will see as I go on, there is direct camera contact with the subject matter. They're looking directly into the lens. This photograph could have happened when I set the camera up, set the timer, and didn't get back time enough to look up. But to me, it looks like one of those photographs where as a lot of young people are, they're in the midst of trying to figure out where they are, where they want to go, and how to get there. I went to school on a prayer. Had no money, had no resources, but I wanted to go, so I figured it out. I went in debt, and I got there, and that's the end of that story for the most part. So, as we move on, I'm going to show you guys the style of photography that I do, and since you guys are familiar with African American photographers of the 21st century, I like to say that my work kind of harkens back to those days of African American photographers and photographing a lot of us. I photograph everybody, but my main subject matter is us, African Americans. This first portrait here is a demonstration of a 4x5 portrait. The 4x5 camera, the actual negative was 4x5 inches, which gave you great enlargements when you blew it up back in the day, before digital and all that. So this is a camera you have to put the black cloth over your head. The image appeared in the ground glass upside down and backwards, so you had to frame from there. And each time you got ready to take the photograph, you have to have your subject remain still, because if he didn't, he'd be out of focus, because it took a long time to actually capture that image. So these are just demonstrations, and keep in mind, this is part of history, my history. That's why I call it time travel photography, time travel with photographs, because I'm going back and bringing you guys up to the current with what I've been doing. Oh, let me go back. This is a photograph of another student from the college. He worked out a lot, always working out around the college, so I decided to ask him if I could photograph him. Now, my style of photography is character portraiture, environmental portraiture, and studio portraiture. In art school, I started to develop a style of black and white portraiture that I've been using ever since, or at least up until digital photography came along, because in digital photography, things are a little different. I'm still kind of working on that black and white thing, because it's different. I'm old school, and it's just different. What can I say? Another portrait, a lot of times I will just ask anyone around that I see that I think is interesting if I can photograph them, because everybody has a certain look or kind of look. Now, mind you, when you photograph somebody, they don't always like their image, because they think they should look like somebody else. Who that is, I don't know. But when I photograph a person, a lot of times it's different from what you're accustomed to seeing when you get up in the morning and look in the mirror and get ready to go to work, because we have an idea of what we want to look like and what we should look like. And sometimes we see that on a photograph, we don't like it because it's not the same idea we have in our heads of what we should look like. All bright and bubbly and happy and all this other good stuff. I'm really not concerned with that kind of things when I photograph someone. And I'm really bad about it now that I don't have to do this kind of stuff for a living. I can be really crazy. It's like, I do what I want to do. If you don't like it, get up and go. That's the kind of the way. I don't literally say that, but I imply that before I even start the photography. If you want me to photograph you, I will photograph you my style, the way I do it, and that's it. I'm not going to make you look like something else or whatever. So anyway, this is another environmental portrait of my niece. Right now, she's probably 40-something. This was a graduation portrait from high school. She wanted me to actually do her high school graduation portraits. I did, because I've done just about every kind of photography there is except a couple. So I did the traditional stuff with the condition that we would go someplace and I could try and do something a little different. And we went out to Palos Verdes in Southern California on the cliffs and shot this. And that image still to this day is one of my favorite images. And once again, this is one that actually doesn't have eye contact with the camera, but it's appropriate, I feel, the way it is. And of course, what I feel is all that matters, right? So there we go. Now, back in the early 21st century, African American photographers, one, for example, James Vanderzee, would photograph funerals. Something that people have different thoughts about, but I always thought it was kind of interesting, because back in the early 21st century, sometimes we weren't, African Americans and people in general weren't able to have photographs of themselves, you know, like we do now. We pull out our cell phones and we shoot 1 million pictures a day. So sometimes the photographer was available. They would come by during the funeral, photograph the deceased person in their coffin. Sometimes that photograph would end up on the wall or in their photo album. And it was a special thing in those days. Also, in the older days, in the early 21st centuries, when someone died, the coffin with the deceased person would be in the living room where everyone could come and see it, and that person lived with them in their home until they were buried. That, of course, has changed. So it was a personal thing back in the day. So this photograph is of my mother in the front, my oldest sister, and the next oldest brother. Now, these two were definitely gone when I came around because they were grown. So I decided that I wanted to photograph my father's funeral. And of course, a lot of times people get interesting about funerals, but since this was my father's, I had all the right that I wanted to do that. So I just did a couple views of this just to show, hearkening back to the old days where photographers did shoot funerals. Now, this is my mother in the white hat and her older sister in the black hat. Now, when my mother was born, her mother died. And that's always a question now because most people around when her mother was born are deceased now, so I don't have a whole lot of information on my grandmother. Of course, now, remember, this is history of photography, time travel through my photography. So all of this basically is personal events, personal things that I've gone through, both personal and professional, the images that you'll see. So now when my mother's mother passed, her older sister, her responsibility was raise the family. So she became my mother's mother at that point because there was a big age difference. Now, this is that same lady years later as she is actually dying from pancreatic cancer in a senior facility in Alabama. So when I traveled back there, I would always stop by and see her. And at this point, she knows she's dying, and she says she's just waiting because there's a phrase that a lot of African-American older folk used in the early days is that I'm waiting to go on over to glory. And what that meant is that they're waiting to die because they're going to be going to heaven as soon as they leave. Now, the thought behind some of that, in my opinion, is that they felt that their lives were going to be better once they went to heaven. It was going to be much better there than it is on the earth at present. Because thinking about all the things that African Americans went through in the early days, the slavery, sharecropping, just unjust treatment, most people thought that their lives in the afterlife was going to be much better. Getting your honey in heaven kind of thing. So I thought this picture was very significant in the fact that she's sitting there looking off, once again, no eye contact with the camera, but appropriate. She's looking off, and she's basically just sitting there waiting to die. I thought it was great that the photograph of her in her younger days was behind her, showing what she used to be and coming up to what she is at present just before she dies. This is a photograph from a Polaroid. It's actually called Polaroid Type 55, and with this type of film, it's shot with that 4x5, the one that puts the black cloth over your head. Once you actually expose the film, you take it out, you pull it apart, you get two pieces. You get the actual Polaroid print, and you get a negative. This was actually printed from the negative because with Type 55, you can take the negative, pull it out. If you see the black holes, those circles over the top, that's where the actual negative was attached to the actual photograph. You pull it apart, drop it in water, and when you're able to, you can put it into fixer to keep your image for years and years. I did a lot of portraits with that kind of technique because it had a real nice look. Now, this photograph is of Ernest Withers. He was a photographer in Memphis during the Civil Rights Movement. The story goes is that the FBI would hire African-American photographers to photograph the civil rights events because they wanted to basically see what the African-American civil rights leaders were talking about. So they would hire these guys to photograph, and they were going to photograph them anyway, but they were actually giving them a source of income so they could pass the pictures over to them so they could see what was going on. Andy Young, who was one of the first mayors of Atlanta, first African-American mayors of Atlanta, was talking about that fact on a documentary I was watching. And the interviewer asked him if he knew about that, about the fact that African-American photographers were hired to actually pass photographs over to the FBI. And he said he did. And he didn't have a problem with it because back in those days, making a living as an African-American just on photography wasn't the thing to do, especially because you had a family, you had bills to meet. African-American photographers in the early 20th century were only able to photograph African-Americans. A lot of times we weren't in neighborhoods where we could make our sole income on photography, so a lot of times people would do it after work on the weekends. They would be say for instance, a mail carrier. They would do photography on the weekend just to make a little money on the side. So that was one of the things that happened in those days, and it was just one of the ways that African-American photographers were able to make a living. This photograph here is a self-portrait of me on my mother's property in Alabama. I'll give you a short synopsis of the story and the happenings with this. I've traveled all my life, for the most part, East Coast, West Coast, working. I was married, lived in Atlanta, came home. My wife of not 5 years decided she wanted to get a divorce. So I said, okay, great, whatever. I had always had a backpack so that I was always camping, stuff like that. I grabbed the backpack, threw it in the back of my car, drove to Alabama, a good 4.5 hours. Because what I like to do in life, always have, is the road is always a selling experience. So I decided to take a road trip, and I was going to spend the night out on the property. Now, I get out to the property, set up camp and everything, and go in for the night. Then the next morning, I get up, and of course, this is one of those once-in-a-lifetime moments, events that happens. I like to document those things. So woke up the next morning, set up the camera on a tripod, and did this photograph because that moment after I left the woods would never ever happen again because life moves on at a really fast pace. So this was one of those things. And in my life, since I've been doing photography since I was 12 years old, it's gotten to be a habit where I try and document most things. Not everything, most things. Because I always carry a camera. And this is one of those moments in life that is always going to be remembered. And this photograph here is the other half of that process. Now, this was my son at 3 years old. When my wife and I got divorced, he was about 2. So you guys saw the photograph of my father early on on the back of the truck. Now, if I told you my father and I didn't talk, it is the absolute truth. I think in his lifetime, he may have said 10 words to me. He wasn't a father of very many words. He was just one of those old Southern guys that just didn't talk. He would talk when he get drunk, but of course you don't want to hear those kind of things. But I told my wife when we were first married, I didn't have a relationship with my father. So I said to her, I don't want our kids growing up without me in their lives. And we both agreed, but of course divorce happened. So at that point, after I left the woods and decided what I was going to do with the remainder of my life, it included him. I moved back to California, to Southern California. I would work 2 or 3 months. I would hit the road. I'd go back to Georgia, stay 2 or 3 weeks, come back, work 2 or 3 months, go back. I would go back and forth because I would drive cross country always, because when I got there, I always needed transportation without renting. And of course, I'm not rich. I'm just kind of doing it as I go. So I would end up staying sometimes 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks. It got to the point where I stayed so long I had to get a job. And of course, being a professional photographer, freelance photographer, I had a few skills in doing other things, so I could work. So it was just a matter of finding work. So I did that and would go back and forth. right now, my son he just turned 21. He's a senior at Mercer University in Macon, Georgia, about to graduate next December. I put my life on hold for a certain bit to make sure that we had a relationship. So that was great. Now that he's up and going, well, actually since then I have 2 more, so I do it all over again. But that was the main thing, is I wanted to be in his life. And of course, the 2 I have now, they live with me every day, fortunately and unfortunately. But it's a beautiful thing. Now, this photograph also is taken on a 4x5 camera. Now, I think I was feeling probably really good that day, because common sense would tell you that you don't shoot kids with a 4x5 camera because they have to sit still. 3 years old have a problem sitting still, standing still. And he did really good, but if you look closely in his left hand, he has a baseball. And of course, that baseball is out of focus because he couldn't hold that still. But for the most part, it was a great thing. Really good photograph. Love it to this day. Another photograph where the subject matter does not have eye contact with the camera. Now, this photograph wasn't set up, it wasn't posed. He was sitting there. I was there probably with my brother or somebody like that, and he was just talking and thinking as he was talking, so I'm shooting photographs. And this is what people around me have gotten accustomed to, especially family. When they see me coming, they know there's going to be a camera somewhere. If I don't have it on me, it's around me somewhere. So they don't pay too much attention to me, so he just kept doing his thing, and I just kept photographing. And this was a photograph that really resonated with me, because my interpretation of this photograph is he's talking to my brother, whoever I'm there with, and it looks like he's thinking about things that maybe should have been, could have been, things he wanted to do, things he couldn't do, the things that he would like to do before he's gone, or whatever. But it was a photograph that really resonated with me. Now, we've gone through the very beginning, the college. Now we're going to go through a little bit of the journey. And of course, still time travel photography, a little bit of my history. And this is a photograph of a good friend of mine. I grew up with him, went to elementary school, high school with him, and we just kept in contact. As a matter of fact, we lost contact. And just last year, I was coming from my son's college in Macon, Georgia, driving back to Atlanta, which is about an hour drive. The phone rings, and it's him. He's in Mexico doing whatever he's doing, because a lot of times people just do what they do, and we talked for the entire ride back to Atlanta. Haven't heard from him since, but these are the kind of connections that I like to make, because I have lots of photographs of him in different stages of his life, different occupations that he's been in, some not so great or whatever, but it's all a part of life. It's all about history and documentation. Now, I shot this photograph in my garage at my house. I turned the 3rd bedroom in my house to a dark room and my garage into a studio. I had the background set up out there, the lights, camera, refrigerator, sofa. I had drinks in the refrigerator, beer, wine, whatever. So when people came to visit me, we went directly to the studio, because I always like documenting people. So if you come by my house, that means you're all mine. I can do whatever I need to with you, photographically speaking. Let's make that clear. So this is another environmental portrait. And once again, I'm always going about doing things. When I meet people that look interesting and I think might allow me to photograph them, I always ask, because we've heard no all our lives. So one more makes no difference. So most people I come into contact are pretty receptive of me photographing them. This is a portrait of Ted Hayes. Used to be, I don't know what he is now, but he was a homeless activist in downtown Los Angeles. He was an engineer by trade. He quit his job, left his family. He became homeless to live on the streets, to advocate for the homeless. So that was pretty interesting. I haven't photographed him since. I haven't seen him since. Now, the next series of images are going to be from a couple trips I did to West Africa. I went to Ghana and Nigeria. The first trip I went to Ghana, I took my bicycle, once again my expedition backpack, because I like to be prepared for everything. I had my a little bit of clothing. I had a tent, I had a stove, I had gas, I could cook, I could live, I was self-sufficient. So I decided to go over on a bicycle trip. And before I went, there was a photographer, and of course I can't think of his name right now. He did the same thing as this. He took a background to Africa and he photographed the indigenous people on this background. And I thought it was a great idea because a lot of times you photograph people in their environment, you look around and you start making assumptions about their life, how they are, who they are, and what they do. So I wanted to do the same thing by taking people out of their environment and putting them into my environment so that you're only faced with the actual photograph of the person. You don't see where they live, who they are, and all that good stuff. And it just gives you a chance to really take the person in and look at the face, because I like to kind of key in on the face and body, of course, but the next series of photographs I say I'm going to do when I get time, I'm going to do a series on faces, just close-ups of different faces of anybody that would allow it. Now, these kids I shot in West Africa and Ghana. I stayed with the last guy, I stayed with his parents. And this was the apartment building where I photographed these guys. Now, when I went there, the country was in a season called Harmattan. And what that is when the strong winds of the northern Sahara blows the dust, the sand. It just blows it into the atmosphere, blows it all the way down into West Africa and beyond. And what happens is that it looks like it's smog. So when the sun is out, it's nice and bright, but there's a little haze so that the lighting is really nice. It's not really harsh. So this was out on their balcony with all natural light. And it made for some really nice photography. And of course, these kids, I was having them teach me their native language, Twi, T-W-E. And of course, being kids, they ended up laughing at me more than they were actually teaching me. They had a great time, but I learned a couple words and we just kept it moving. So these are images from West Africa. Now this is a storekeeper in Elmina, which is a place one of the slave castles are, because one of the things I wanted to do is ride my bicycle up and down the coast of Africa and visit the slave castles. There's about maybe 6 or more castles along the coast. Now, back in the day, in Africa, countries such as France and other countries, a bunch of them, of course I forget all of them, but they would come to the continent of Africa and they would actually take the natural resources out, spices and stuff like that, until the slave trade became popular. Once that became popular, they would actually bring in the slaves into the slave castles. They would put them in these little cells, and that would be the last time they would ever see the continent of Africa, because during the night, they would take them out through a small door out into the ships, and the next thing you know, they were out in the Atlantic Ocean, headed for parts unknown, lots of the places here. So this was a shopkeeper along the way, so I would stop there and talk to them, make a little money, or spend a little money for them, and stuff like that. This is another photograph, portrait, that I shoot in studio. This is a good friend of mine, Anderson Pratt. He was one of the guys I stayed with when I was going to actually go visit my son. This was a house that he had where he kept his collection. He was married, so he lived in another house, so I would stay here by myself. So I had him come over one day so I could photograph him in his environment. Photograph of a curator from an African American museum. This was a good friend of mine I went to art school with in Atlanta. He was from North Carolina. He said he grew up poor and he wanted to see where I grew up. So when we had a moment, I took him with me to where the little shack was, and he just thought we were the poorest people in the world. We probably were. At that time, I didn't really know it, because my thought of being poor is wanting food, being hungry, and not being able to get it. We never had that, because even in the woods, there were plenty of things to eat, berries and stuff like that. Plus, we grew our own produce, so you could actually go out into the garden, grab a carrot or something and eat it. So we were never hungry. he grew up in a city in North Carolina, and he said they were always hungry because they had nothing in the refrigerator. And of course, being in the city, there were no gardens like there were in the South, like we have. And the chair that he's sitting in is, I call it George the chair. After my divorce in Atlanta, I moved back out here. I had some questions about a lot of things because obviously you guys haven't been divorced, hopefully, because you haven't been married. That's a good thing. But that brought up a lot of questions. So I was thinking about photography and actually not doing photography anymore, but I didn't want that to happen. So I grabbed this chair and I decided to give myself a self-assignment. With this chair, the story goes, it's a chair that is velour, some 70s kind of chair. It was the highlight of the home. Everybody sat in the chair, everybody loved the chair. And one day, the kids grew up, they left. The parents, they didn't sit in the chair anymore because they were doing their own things separately. So it was thrown out onto the curb. So the story I was writing is that the chair was sitting out there, I was passing by, and it stopped me. I've given the chair a life in the whole 9 yards. So the chair stops me, and we're talking, and it's like, well, I'm homeless, I don't have any place to go. Either I stay here, they take me to the dump and break me apart, and my life is over, or I can do something else. So I says, well, look, this was one of the times I was heading to Atlanta to see my son. I says, look, I'm going to Atlanta. You can ride with me if you like. And the next photograph, you see me putting the chair in the truck, and then we're off to Alabama. So we stopped along the way to shoot pictures, blah, blah, blah. So this was one of the things that I used to keep me thinking about photography because so much stuff was going on. And I wasn't doing as much photography because I was now looking to do other things for work because I was going back and forth so much. But that was one of the things that I did to actually keep the light burning in the camera and stuff like that. Now, this is my current wife. We have been married now almost 16 years. When I meet people, this is when I first met her. I always want to photograph them if I think I'm going to be at least starting a friendship or something like that. I like to photograph them in stages so I can see the progress. It's a part of history, it's a part of documentation, it's a part of who I am as a photographer. And of course, she is still around, fortunately. And I photograph her not quite as much as I would like to because now we have these lives that go on, kids and all that good stuff, and it kind of takes us away. But I did just photograph her for her real estate business card. It wasn't the type of photography I would like to do with her, but we just haven't made time for that. This is an artist that actually has moved to Oakland now, but we met in Long Beach. This is when I first met him, and this was some years later. Once again, this is a history of him as a person, a bit of a history, not everything. But like I said, I like to photograph people more than once. Now, this was a sculptor at the school I went to in Atlanta. This was my mechanic in Long Beach that always worked on my car. I would go by, and he would work on my car, and I would just sit there. And of course, being in a garage is almost like being in a barbershop. Everything happens, everybody talks about everything, everybody comes through. And this was one of the most interesting characters. So I wanted to actually photograph him because when you think about history, life, documentation, everybody's not always going to be here. So if you have certain thoughts, or if I had certain thoughts of them, I would try and photograph them. So when I looked at the photograph, I'm instantly taken back to the moment it happens. Now, this is my father once again. These photographs were taken when I was attending school in Atlanta. I would jump in my car, run down, and hang out with him for a minute. Once again, we didn't talk very much. So I would say, okay, Pop, let me have you stand over there. And he'd go stand over here, and he'd stand over here, and stand over there. And once he got tired and he didn't want to be photographed anymore, he'd walk away. And we were done. And that was our communication. So we did that up until, he passed away. Because he passed away from cancer also. He smoked not Johnny Walker, but I forget the name brand, but it's the tobacco in a red can. You open it up and you roll your own cigarettes. Of course, no filters and stuff like that. So you're getting the full effect. So he died of throat cancer. Once again, history, documentation, photography. So this is another photograph, environmental photograph. This is Wes Gale. He was an actor in a lot of the black exploitation movies in Los Angeles. His best friend was Dolomite. If you guys are probably not old enough to know Dolomite, but you should probably Google it one day. He was one of the first comedians that actually financed his own movies, where he was a star. And of course, he was this kung fu fighting, club owning, woman's man. He was all that in all of his movies, and this was one of his sidekicks. He's played a lot of different roles in Dolomite's movies. He was around in the early days like Richard Pryor, that kind of thing, but he was at that time one of the most raunchiest comedians, period. And of course he made a living with it because it was his style. Another photograph of, environmental photograph rather, of a cowgirl, a cowboy, and of course once again, I meet people in different situations and we start talking, and if there's a connection I can make in photography, I would try and exploit that connection. This was an expatriate from Los Angeles. He moved to Ghana and retired there because there's always, I guess maybe every 20 years, there's a resurgence of movement towards Africa, and he was part of that resurgence or that movement in the 1990s when I went over. He has since passed on. Really good guy to talk to when he was in Africa. We made friends through some event we were at. Really, really good guy, great person to talk to, except when he started drinking. When he started drinking, all bets were off. So at that point, I would have to get up and leave because it was something that reminded me of my father. My father was a big drinker, and I wasn't too much into those kind of things. Now, this is the late Joe Sample. There was an event, or it was an event. I forget what the exact event was, but I was photographing him and a lot of other celebrities for Warner Brothers, for the record company. And this was one of the photographs that I really, really liked. Now, we've gone through the beginning, we've gone through the journey. Now, let's get into the destination. Now, what the destination is, I can't necessarily say because the story's being still written. I don't know where it's going to go. I don't know how it's going to end. As I said, I am 57. I have a whole lot more living to do, a whole lot more traveling, a whole lot more photography to do, a whole lot of videos to do also. So now, in art school, when I started there doing actual photography classes, I met with my instructor and he said, you can show me your images and I'm going to critique them and we'll go from there. And I asked him, what assignments do I have? He said, there are no assignments. You do what you want to do. Now that was different from traditional school because you would always have an assignment and it's due at a certain time. So I decided I was going to do couples. Unfortunately, I don't have any of the couples that I photographed in art school in this presentation, but now as life come full circle, I've come back to couples. And I started, this is the cover of the first book I published. And of course, it came about because of past events. I got a divorce early on. I wanted to find out why it didn't work and what does it take to make it happen. So I interviewed like 50 couples in this book of all different ethnic backgrounds to find out what it took for them to stay married and if there was a difference in the races when it came to marriage. There wasn't, because it basically comes down to the two people handling day-to-day life. So this was the first book. Once again, I went back to couples. Now, the second book, I took it a little further and I did African Americans that have been married for 20 plus years. And of course, you can see it says that includes bonus section on internet marriages. So I have couples in there that actually met on the internet and got married. My wife and I met that way also. So I wanted to show that in the 21st century, there are different ways to meet people, whether it's for friendship, personal relationships, business contacts, or anything. It is possible, and that's what's a lot of times is happening these days. And of course, you guys know about that with all these dating sites out there and all this kind of good stuff. It does work. It's a little tricky, but it does work.
Okay, so
Whoa, hey, hey.
What dating sites did y'all meet on?
It actually wasn't a dating site. I think it was just Yahoo's personal. So the backstory on that is after art school, I started showing photography. I would do a lot of shows every year. It got too expensive, so back in 1999, I started my first website. So that was free. So I put my images up on the website to get people to see them. And this is early days of the internet. There wasn't a billion websites out then. So my thought was, well, I got it up there, but how do I get people to go and see the images? So I'm going like, oh, I can go to the personals. So I would go to the personals, and of course I would always approach women because women are just a lot easier to deal with than some things. So if you had in your profile, you like art, you like photography, you like video, you like travel, I said, oh, that's a great candidate. I would send you a note. I say, Miss Jane, I'm Otis G. Sanders. I have a website. I'd like you to go and take a look at my photography, blah, blah, blah. They would get it, and it's a new thing, so they said, oh, cool. They would go and see it. They would look at it. They would comment, say, great, whatever, whatever. So I would say, oh, I could keep sending them information every month because I would upload 7 images on the 7th of each month because I am the 7th son, so I kept that 7th thing going. So my thought was if your images are the same all the time, people will see it once. They wouldn't want to come back unless you change them. So I happened to be going through different places, and I saw my current wife's ad, whatever you call it, and sent it to her. She replied, she went to it, and she started talking about the images, and we started a conversation back and forth, back and forth. And one thing led to another. I finally asked, well, where are you? She says, I'm in Southern California. I said, so am I. And we talked and talked and talked. And this is, of course, email, because I think these days you can find out a lot about a lot of people and what they write, how they write, sentence structures, where they can write, or anything like that. So she seemed like she was all right. So at some point, and of course, I'm real impatient. I said, look, we've been emailing enough. I'll give you my phone number. We can talk on the phone if you want to. And we did that. Say that again?
We got the friends on, that's what I'm talking about.
Oh, yeah. We started all of that. So we started talking, and everything was good. And one thing led to another. We met. I think we met at El Pollo Loco just to meet and stuff like that. And we became friends. So one thing led to another. We started hanging out. Because one thing in her profile it says she was looking for a friend to do activities. Now, since I was divorced, I was just staying home working. I didn't do anything. So I said, well, hanging out with somebody would be good. I didn't know it would lead to marriage. I didn't know it would lead to 2 kids later, mortgage, and all this other good stuff. Because after I got a divorce, I said, well, now's the time. I'm going to be the world famous photographer, traveling the world, doing everything. But it didn't happen that way. So, but that's how that worked. Does that answer your question?
No, sir. Another question.
Okay.
Where's your books purchased? Like, if I want to purchase a book.
Well, they are on Amazon. I have a store on Amazon. It's called 7 Sun Productions, or you could just type in my name, Otis G. Sanders. And you can order it that way. Of course, I have books with me all the time, so if you want one, I can get one for you today.
So is there anything that you, since you interviewed these couples, like what is the secret to a lasting marriage?
What is the secret? Well, first of all, making the right choice in the person that you're going to hang out with, because we know sometimes when people are not right for us, but we want to make it work. But there's a lot of things that go into that. That's a whole nother seminar. But what it comes down to is being able to, in my opinion, because it's just my opinion. I wrote this book not as a self-help. I wrote it as a photography tabletop book, so that if you read the articles that you'll get some of the information that's in there. But at any rate, you have to be able to work together. You have to still stand each other after 5 years or 10 years, or after the great looks have worn off. He gets, a big stomach, she gains weight, lose hair, whatever. You have to still love a person. So if you got that in the beginning, I think most other stuff can be worked out. That's just an elementary observation. Anything else?
We'll just say this up.
Okay, all right, no problem. So, this is part of that coming in full circle. So, my life started out in that little shack, went to art school, started doing all this good stuff. Now, the destination, like I said, is still open. There is no way for me to know exactly where it's going to go. I actually don't want to know where it's going to go. I want to be surprised, because someone asked me in an interview I was just doing with Jewel Diamond Taylor. She asked me something like if I planned my life the way it has happened, because now I've been in photography for 20, 30 years or something like that. So as I go now, I've always been freelance, and just about 3 years ago, I began working full-time as a photographer for the Los Angeles Sheriff Department in their crime lab. So she was asking me, well, did you plan that? I said, no, I try not to plan too much. I just kind of go with the flow of life and where life takes me. And it's always been something in photography. So I've just basically stuck with it and had fun with it. So that's where it's taken me. So these are some of the images in both books, actually. Now, this last book I did was just on African Americans, because I wanted to show that regardless of what's said about African American love, marriage, kids, and all that good stuff, African Americans have always had long-standing, sustaining relationships where they've been actually happy. And of course, there's a lot of talk about out of wedlock kids being born, things like that. That does happen. Some of it is because of the times, and a lot of times the times actually dictate what we do and how we do it as we go on. But I just wanted to make sure that the idea of African Americans with successful marriages is out there and always has been. Now, this is one of the couples that actually met online. They actually met on Facebook. They were friends of friends. And he would always see her post about something some of his friends said, and he just chimed in one day and says, hey, this, that, and other, and he decided to ask her to come by for a beer. Now, they knew each other, and they didn't know each other personally, but they knew friends that knew each other. So I'm sure they asked, well, if this guy, is he okay? Is he an axe murderer or something like that? So I guess they gave him the go-ahead. So she finally stopped by, and his way of determining if she was a good candidate for him was by the beer that she chose to drink. I don't drink. Beer is not something I would ever drink anyway, but he said that she chose a really good quality of beer to drink, so that started their relationship. However people do it, hey, whatever works. So these are just more images from that book. So now we've talked about time travel photography. We've talked about time travel with photographs. We've talked about the journey and the destination. So at this point, that brings me to the present. Now, what the present holds for me is more photography, being a YouTube content creator, and also life and what happens next. And of course, we go all the way back to that little house in the woods again. What I'm doing now as a part of my YouTube channel, I'm building a small house in the woods from ground up. So every 2 to 4 months, like I did with my son, I will go back to Alabama. I was just there in March, and I am building my house, a 400 square foot house in the woods, and that's about the size of a 2-car garage, so that I'll have a place in the woods where I can go and think when I want to get away from the crowds of Southern California. So with that, I will conclude, and if there are any questions, I'll be more than happy to answer.